Okay.
All right. So good afternoon to everyone. Okay. And thank you for spending your Monday afternoons with us for this diplomatic hour, which is the seventh episode of this series. So I will be your host and moderator for this afternoon. My name is Eric Capistrano, professor from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. But before we get off to the formal part of this afternoon's session, let me turn over the floor to the president of Miriam College and founding director of the Institute of Global Affairs, Ambassador Laura Del Rosario. Ma'am?
Thank you very much, Eric. And to everybody, I want to greet you a pleasant afternoon. And as Eric said, this is our seventh episode. Global Affairs and Diplomacy is a very young course program at Miriam College. It's 2 years old, but somehow it has already attracted enough attention from young senior high school students. I suppose it's because of the condition right now in the world around us, regionally, whether it's in Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, or even in Europe, Ukraine and Russia and all over. And I think people realize now that, they have to be engaged and understand what's happening around them as all these events do impact on their lives. And of course, for this seminar, we're going to discuss the Indo-Pacific economic framework, which is actually also hung or hinge upon the Quad, the efforts of the four major countries in the Asia Pacific, namely the US, India, Australia, and Japan, and how this what they call this cooperation, this arrangement is really trying to help improve the region economically and also somehow strengthen the political security. Because when you strengthen the economic aspect of a country, you also strengthen the political aspect of a country. For us in diplomacy, especially for me, when I focus on economic diplomacy, to me, politics is economics and vice versa. So of course, at this point, I wish to thank in advance Professor Dindo Manhit of the ADR, the Albert Del Rosario Strat-Based Initiative, and of course, Dr. Jayan Menon, who is in Singapore, right? So we have, people across the borders joining us here. So Eric, I'll give it back to you and then just give the background on the whole concept that we are trying to get into today. And again, good afternoon to everyone.
Thank you, Ambassador Del Rosario. So, okay, so just for the information of everybody so that we can all be in the same page as we move along for this afternoon session, let me first introduce to you the organizers of this event. So 2 years ago, through the Office of the President of Miriam College, the Institute of Global Affairs and Diplomacy was launched. And this institute offered a Bachelor of Arts in Global Affairs and Diplomacy, which focuses on the political and humanitarian affairs. As part of the efforts to bolster IGAD's profile and contribute to enhancing policy discourses in the Philippines and in the region, I got started an online talk show on the political, economic, and humanitarian crisis issues. For this afternoon, we will be focusing on the diplomatic hour on the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific economic framework and its implications for the Philippines and Southeast Asia. So let me read some of the excerpts from straight from the White House so that we can have a proper introduction to today's session. So in Asia, President Joe Biden and a dozen Indo-Pacific partners launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity back in May. So it is aimed to strengthen our ties in this critical region to define the coming decades for technological innovation and the global economy. The White House also further said that this framework will create a stronger, fairer, more resilient economy for families, workers, and businesses in the United States and in the Indo-Pacific region. This afternoon, we are most fortunate to have two distinguished speakers who will share their thoughts and opinions regarding this endeavor, this framework as put forward by the Biden administration. So let me introduce to you our two speakers for this afternoon. First off is Dr. Jayant Menon, Senior Fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Yusof Ishak Institute, based in Singapore. So Dr. Menon joined the Institute as a Senior Fellow to continue his work on trade and development in the Asian region, following his early retirement from ADB in 2020. His last post at the ADB was lead economist in the Office of the Chief Economist. He began work life as an academic in Australia, spending almost a decade at the Center for Policy Studies at Monash University, one of the leading centers for computable general equilibrium modeling. And he has also worked at several academic institutions, including the University of Melbourne, Victoria University, the American University in Washington, D.C., and the ADB Institute in Tokyo. He has served as a board director of CDRI, Cambodia, and on the advisory board of the University of Nottingham in Malaysia. And he holds adjunct appointments in Australian National University, University of Nottingham, UK Ideas, Malaysia. He has authored and edited over 15 books, 40 chapters, and 80 articles in peer-reviewed journals. As an academic myself, I do aspire that I will reach that goal someday. And our second speaker is Professor Victor Andres Dindo Manhit, who is the Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of Strat-Based Group. So since he founded the Strat-Based Group in 2004, as a public policy analyst and strategist, he has provided top-level strategic analysis and thought leadership on global issues in the Philippines. Thinking beyond politics for his political risk assessments, he draws on a combination of backward-looking, fact-based, data-driven analytics with forward-looking thinking and strategic policy options. He has identified investment and business opportunities, gathered critical intelligence to overcome regulatory challenges, and develop deep relationships in key departments and agencies. Aside from his work with the Strat-Based Group, he's also the Philippine country head of Bauer Group Asia, a leading strategic advisory firm specializing in the Asia Pacific. He is also the former chair and retired associate professor of political science from the De La Salle University in Manila and has authored numerous commentaries and papers on geopolitical issues, governance, and political reforms, specializing in strategic studies and management, international politics, and public policy analysis. And for the information of the audience, unfortunately, our third speaker, Mr. David Gamble, who is the economic counselor from the United States Embassy, was unable to join us because of more urgent concerns last minute. So we do apologize to the audience in advance, okay, on behalf of Mr. Gamble. Okay, so without further ado, I am now turning over the floor first, okay, to Dr. Menon for his opening insights on our topic this afternoon. Dr. Menon?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. And let me start by thanking the organizers for having me here today to talk to all of you. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you virtually. I wish I was there in Manila. I spent a long time while I was at the ADB living in Manila. Actually, I'll be back on Friday to continue some work with the ADB, but let me very quickly give you an overview of IPEF from an economist's perspective and raise a few issues that we can pick up later on in the conversation about where we go from here. So I think the first point to note, as Eric has already mentioned and Ambassador Del Rosario referred to, is that IPEF is, in a sense, a bid by the Biden administration to re-engage economically with this region, right? It was launched in Tokyo on May the 23rd of this year, and it has 14 countries covering 40% of world GDP. I won't go through all 14, but it's more important to identify the ones missing from the region. For ASEAN, it's got everyone except Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, the newest members. And for RCEP, it has all the +5 countries and India, which pulled out of RCEP but came into IPEF. And then we have Fiji from the Pacific, and of course the US. The framework comprises 4 policy pillars. These are trade, supply chains, clean energy, decarbonization and infrastructure, and finally, tax and corruption. So member countries are free to choose which policy pillar they want to sign up for. So there's quite a bit of flexibility built in, but once they pick a pillar, they have to abide by all the commitments within that pillar. So the price for this flexibility, however, as a selling point to get people on board, is that there's a possibility of cherry picking. In other words, countries pick the ones that they feel are in their immediate interests and leave the more difficult ones behind. So you can't do the kind of trade-offs that you often find in a lot of these types of agreements. The White House has made it clear that countries are invited to participate in collective discussions, and that's all for now, but they hope that it would lead towards future negotiations on each of these pillars. In fact, the first official in-person ministerial meeting was held in LA just a few days ago on the 9th of September, hosted by US Trade Representative Catherine Tai and Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimundo. And I'll say a bit more about this a bit later. So participating countries are only committed to an initial round of discussions, which may not necessarily mean seeing the negotiations through to the very end. Nor is it clear at the moment that the negotiations will actually lead to binding commitments. So a lot of things are still to be worked out. And I think this is by design to make sure that they get the maximum uptake from the very start. But it'll have to come back they'll have to come back to dealing with concrete measures sooner or later, but they wanted it to get off to a good start. And actually, 13 countries is not a great start, if you think about it, for this vast region, for such a flexible agreement. But let's talk about that in a minute. Okay, so I think it is difficult, however, to gauge how meaningful the IPEF will be in contributing towards US re-engagement in the region right now. But it's a start, and many have welcomed this, especially after the long hiatus, and especially after the difficult times with the previous Trump administration. So IPEF is the first trade initiative from the US, right? After it withdrew from the TPP, if you recall, in January 2017. The TPP was led by the Obama administration, but it has now gone forward as the CPTPP without the US. But IPEF is not a free trade agreement in the conventional sense. So what is it? I think the trade pillar, which is a critical part of it, is designed to set rules and standards in areas such as labor, environment, and regulatory practices, right? So it's all about setting rules. However, it does not come with any compensating increase in market access, right? Which could make it less attractive for many ASEAN developing countries, right? Singapore, where I am, is quite keen to embrace this because they are at a different level of development. But many other countries in ASEAN are not that far developed, and so will have concerns about, sticks and limited carrots, if you like. As you know, the Philippines, Indonesia, and many of these countries are still predominantly engaged in agriculture and manufacturing. So goods market access in these sectors for a very important developed market is of paramount importance to them. So they'll want to exchange that concession. And this was played out at the LA meeting that I mentioned a few days ago. India made it very clear that they were not interested in negotiating trade without concessions being exchanged. So already we can see the cracks emerging from this kind of approach, which actually focuses on rules, but not on conceding market access. IPEF's rules and standards will require participating countries to make painful short-term adjustments, unattractive, I think, to those struggling to recover from the pandemic and the multiplicity of disruptions currently affecting world growth, trade, and investment. But the sales pitch emphasizes long-term gains, such as promotion of regional peace and security, which are critical for sustaining growth. In addition, participating countries may expect enhanced economic cooperation and integration to bring with it more FDI from the US. That's the promise in the longer term. This might appear far away and sort of very intangible, but it could be important for ASEAN, since the US is the largest source country for FDI still, right? In terms of stock rather than flow. And in 2020, for instance, before the pandemic hit, the US accounted for 34.7 billion, a quarter of the investments received in that year. So developing economies in ASEAN aspire to tap into FDI for areas such as digitalization, biotech, and renewable energy from a developed partner like the US. And the IPEF is certainly playing up these opportunities in selling its attractiveness without this sort of market access concessions. Right, now I'm aware of time, so let me just very quickly move on to this issue about choosing between the US and China, which I think is in everyone's minds when you talk about IPEF, right? Now, while ASEAN stands to gain from IPEF, it must, as always, find the right balance between these two superpowers, given IPEF is intended as an alternative to China. But both the US and China are important economic partners of ASEAN. And so ties with both countries are important for the region. Furthermore, and I want to emphasize this point, regional supply chains are and will continue to be China-centered for the foreseeable future. Whatever the US tries to do, this is the reality that we have to accept. I think all ASEAN IPEF signatory countries recognize this and are struggling to balance these two, partners and economic versus strategic realities. Right. So I want to now finish up by quickly turning to where we are and where we go from here, right? So IPEF has a very diverse group of countries, and it's going to be difficult, I think, to see how consensus can be built around such a group. Nevertheless, making binding commitments will require protected negotiations, and these are still possible. Negotiations are slated to last between 12 to 18 months, but I will not be at all surprised if they take a lot longer because of the difficult issues on the table and also the diversity of the membership that I mentioned. Although there is potential for IPEF to play an important role in moving the region towards a more rules-based trading system, there's a good chance that it may not actually amount to very much at all. And this is something we must come to terms with, right? We cannot put all our eggs in the IPEF basket, given the very sort of intangible nature of the agreement. And so, we need to hedge our bets in some sense, is what I'm saying. On the US side, the long-term prospects of IPEF may be impaired if it remains a presidential executive order rather than a US Senate-backed treaty, right? And that's all it is now. It's a White House initiative, and it's very much a Biden initiative, right? So we need to turn that into a treaty which requires US Senate backing. And as you know, the midterms, which are coming up in November, could change the balance in the Senate. I'm not going to try and guess in which direction, but I think, for this to be a lasting initiative, it has to be more than a Biden measure, and has to move away from the White House to a treaty, and that will require some kind of partisan negotiations in the Senate, but only time will tell. So with that, Eric, I'm sorry for having gone over a bit longer than I planned, but thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion. Back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Menon. Even with that brief overview that you've shared, especially me as an outsider, a non-economist, I'm more of a business background. It is like opened up a lot of questions and opened up a lot of opportunities for discussions later on. Okay? But before we actually, I need to stop myself and to start asking questions. But I will be yielding the floor now to Professor Manhit for his own take on this topic that we have this afternoon. Professor Manhit.
Thank you, Fred, and good morning to everyone, and good morning to Ambassador Laura, the team that invited me for this discussion. In StratBase, we have tracked the past few months after the election, what we call 8 geopolitical and economic risks that we are facing post-Duterte administration, post-COVID environment. And when we published a book, we call the Beyond the Crisis book last May, in the introductory chapter, I spoke of changes in the international political economy, geopolitical risk, side by side with global rise of inequality and political instability, which continues to complicate global risk. But we need to factor in the reality that we are living in a world where there are interconnectedness among states. And over the years, the global political structure has gradually shifted, from my point of view, not from a US and China perspective, but from multipolar world, wherein states are economically, geopolitically, and strategically interconnected. Regional and global issues have underscored the importance of multilateral and unilateral cooperation in collectively managing risks and challenges. This is where I see the Indo-Pacific economic framework for prosperity. Mentioned earlier, launched last May 2022 by US President Joe Biden, where we see 14 Indo-Pacific countries. What do they have in common? I think they believe on a rules-based international order. Some would say that the IPEF is a way for the US to reassert its economic regional role after the withdrawal during the Trump presidency of the US from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Meant or launched as a non-trade agreement focused on 4 pillars, which I will discuss in a while. But just last week, the founding partners, 14 countries, convened for the first in-person Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity ministerial meeting in Los Angeles, California. And to break down these 4 pillars, analyzing it, and just for the purpose of our audience trying to understand, is that it speaks of a connected economy, focus on trade, in this case, digital trade, agricultural trade, transparency, competition policy, trade facilitation. A lot of opportunities for medium-scale enterprises, especially in the Philippines, which constitute a big percentage for business enterprises. We have seen the shift, the digital transformation of the Philippines with regards to the past 2 years during the pandemic, how digital technology has shaped how we move across demographics, we saw it. So this could be an opportunity for us. It also speaks of its second pillar, a resilient economy. It deals with supply chains, how they can improve transparency, diversity, security, and sustainability. And this point reminds me of certain policy that I was tracking within the region. I go beyond ASEAN in my look always. I've seen the new southbound policy launched by Taiwan right before the start of the pandemic, I think February 2022. The idea was to move some of their factories to countries in ASEAN, like the Philippines, or the new southern policy of Korea, the Republic of Korea, or the Economic Security Act just passed by the Japanese legislature to look at, to even subsidize and move their factories, their manufacturing plants from China to the ASEAN region or to countries that are part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Or what about clean economy, energy? We all know that we need to recover from this pandemic and really face also one big global challenge, which is climate change, climate weirding, as some would say. We need a green economic recovery, even among companies in the Philippines, because of their standards that's being guided by so-called ESG standards. They'd like to promote clean energy, climate resilience, deploying clean energy and climate-friendly technologies. How do we make the most of it in terms of carbon capture, utilization, transport, and storage? What about sustainable land, water, and ocean solutions, especially for a vulnerable country like the Philippines with regards to sudden changes in climate? Or the issue of the fair economy, governance, corruption issues, rule of law. These are very important values that I believe these 14 countries all share. So when I look at the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, in our discussion with my colleagues in the Bauer Group Asia, we just came up with an analysis just this morning, and I'd like to share it with everyone. With the exception of India on the trade pillar, all of the other 14 countries agreed to participate across the 4 pillars, which I mentioned earlier, with negotiation objectives agreed in a series of ministerial statements. India has articulated its reservations and its wider focus on bilateral economic pacts, just like how its position with RCEP. This continued progress on the IPEF does not change the reality on the ground, a worrisome picture for the United States on the trade agreement front. The United States is an outsider with regards to RCEP, an outsider with regards to the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for TP, and the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement. China's moves reinforce the need for Washington, D.C., or in this case, the Biden government, to seriously get back into the trade game in the U.S., in Asia. And the critical core of this is the private sector. That has always been the core strength of the United States. IPEF agreements are expected to be finalized, as I say. So for me, I look at the IPEF as a possible boon to our own country's economic and commercial diplomacy, but it would depend on how the Biden administration positions itself with regard to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, vis-a-vis during the APEC in Thailand, during the East Asia Summit in Cambodia. So how they turn a concept, an idea, into executing it and ensuring that these 4 pillars bring about prosperity among the 14 countries and defines itself as countries that is united, believing in a rule-based international order, one that can geopolitically deal with the challenges internally to each country. Because at the end of the day, the value of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for a country like the Philippines is that it needs to serve our own national interests. And what is our own national interest? I've heard our own president speak of the need to adopt a more investment-driven growth trajectory to ensure sustainability, to uplift our people. So we have to look at it from that point of view. How will it deal with the challenge of inequality we're facing post-pandemic? How will it deal with the digital divide that we have seen with the digital transformation of the Philippines during the pandemic? How do we use it as an opportunity to address this long economic emergency, whereby we should learn our lesson that a service-driven, consumption-driven growth trajectory is not enough for the Philippines. We need investment-driven growth, especially in the area of manufacturing or even agriculture. How do we compete and really generate more in the environment through guided by the environment, through trade, so we can have this green economic recovery. At the end of the day, from a geopolitical point of view, we're dealing with the reality of asymmetric security challenges. When I see countries from the Quad that was mentioned by Ambassador Laura earlier, to IPEF, trying to engage, to talk, to separate one that tends to use coercion as they deal with their smaller neighbors. I would like to hope and wish that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity will move forward beyond the politics, the domestic politics of the United States, and really become a player in the region. I'll end with those thoughts and happy to exchange and answer questions.
Right, thank you, Professor Manhit, for that. At least now we have some idea of what the Philippines can also expect going forward with this one. Really appreciate the insights from it. Again, as a person outside of this who's more into business, probably most of us would be looking at some patterns of certainty, assurances that we can take advantage of should we go into this initiative, okay, head on. Okay, head on. So thank you. Okay, thank you for that one. Okay, so time check, it's 3:07 p.m. By my clock here. So first of all, we will be starting to field in questions, okay, from the audience, and we'll spend a few minutes, okay, to try to weigh in on these questions. Oh, and the very first question is something, okay, something that's also a very interesting one. Okay. So the question is, can the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework match China's Belt and Road Initiative? Okay. So probably Dr. Menon first, and then Professor Manhit can weigh in on these.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So that's an interesting question. I think we are seing how the BRI, or Belt and Road Initiative, is facing a sort of turning point right now. There's been growing concerns about debt diplomacy and other issues of environment and so on, with China's involvement, especially in Africa, but also more recently in countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan and so on. And so the Biden administration has got its own version of that Build Back Better initiative around infrastructure. So that I don't know how they're going to link that directly to IPEF, but I guess they will. It's all part of the US Biden administration approach. But we need to see how much money is involved. We don't know yet, the actual dollars and cents that will be put into this sort of initiative. But so that is clearly going to come under the infrastructure, energy, decarbonization pillar, and there's room for that. I think, like I said, the BRI, I think, is receding at the moment. China has got its own internal difficulties it's currently facing. Its growth is slowing dramatically because of hanging on to the zero COVID policy, and also there are other issues with real estate and finance that it's finally having to confront. So I think you can see there will be a major shift, and there'll be a big gap to be filled. And the US, I think, can play an important role, but also the other multilaterals, the World Bank, ADB, and even the AIIB, and so on, can come into play that part. So I think IPEF is just sort of like the umbrella umbrella agreement that has infrastructure as a component, but it doesn't, in and of itself, come with any money, but it can actually coordinate the process. Yeah, so let me stop there.
All right. Thank you for that, Dr. Menon. Professor Manhit, your thoughts?
I'll just follow up from the points raised by Dr. Menon. Is that when you look at this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, I look at the countries that signed up on it, and you see how it can be that alternative to the BRI, especially with even our own sad experience, if we will consider the ODA packages that we had with China. It failed the test of our environmental laws. Still, previous government pushed for it, though our own commission audit said it failed its test. Procurement-wise also, and even the debt diplomacy that the countries continue to experience in other Asian and African countries. And in the end, when you see members like Japan, who provided an alternative to the BRI model in our part of the world, you see yourself that, imagine, multiply that to 14 countries. That for me is an opportunity, with the support of ADB, World Bank, which, even with the hype and the noise of the previous government with regards to their relationship with China, continue to be the main drivers of support for the Philippine economy. I'm just being factual because the previous government kept on talking how important the China investments are. But government data did not reflect that. Their own government data did not reflect that beyond the propaganda. So when I see the IPF, I see it as an opportunity for member countries to work together, bring their own capacities along those 4 pillars. And as I've said, key to that, I just don't look at it as a US concept. Because the Indo-Pacific is a concept now that drives foreign policy of Japan, that drives the foreign policy of Australia, New Zealand, India, that drives the foreign policy of even the European Union and the United Kingdom. So imagine if you come up with and transform that security framework into now an economic framework and turn this talk into substance. And better if it's even driven by the private sector or by alternative resources can be provided to countries needing one, especially on these 4 pillars.
Okay, all right. So yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you for that, Professor Manhit. It's so just to summarize it a bit. It's it's still very early on. We don't know how much money is going to be involved, so there might be some uncertainty there. But at the same time, we should also treat this as an opportunity. It's not like at least we're going to have different channels as far as like the participating countries are concerned, as to where we can further, we can further our international relations or opportunities for development with the United States in tow. Okay, so thank you for the responses and thank you for the question. For that one. Now we will proceed to the next one. I am yielding much of the commentaries and the questions here to the expertise of our audience here. So our next question comes from Ms. Mary Keisha Lisay. So let me read it out. Okay, so the IPEF is still in the talking stage, since the US creation of the IPEF is an attempt to remove China's foothold in Asia. So how likely is it that the ASEAN countries will enter IPEF negotiations, especially given ASEAN's non-interference policy? Maybe we'll reverse the order now. Professor Manhit first, and then we'll have Dr. Menon to weigh in on this question.
Thank you for that question. I think the reality that ASEAN countries who are members of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, part of the 14, will always view it from their own national interests. Will it serve their own interests with regards to trade? Will it serve their interests with regards to being part of a supply chain for their own internal economy, their manufacturing sector? Is it part of their interest to push clean energy in their own country? Or do they practice the values of governance, rule of law? This is very important in ensuring an investment in the environment that is conducive to greater trade, greater investment. So for me, that will decide it. Just like it took some years for RCEP. I started focusing on some efforts on ASEAN as early as 2007. I was hearing RCEP already at the time. Then you hear about TPP. So this ideas keeps on evolving. We have heard of APEC through the years. It's how a country values this kind of engagement, this kind of framework. So for me, it's really an opportunity. And I don't really like to see it. And I hope it goes beyond simply being driven by the government, the administration of Biden. And countries that signed up see it itself an opportunity, these 14 countries, to really strengthen an integrated framework to work together to attain these 4 pillars to the interest of each national interest of each nation. That's when we see the value of this Indo-Pacific economic framework for prosperity to be beneficial to countries in ASEAN.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Professor Manhit. Dr. Menon, your thoughts?
Yes, I don't have much to add to what Professor Manhit has mentioned. I think he's covered the key issues. I would just say that I think as Professor Manhid just said, the countries in this region should engage in areas that are in their national interests, and they should avoid being dragged into this rivalry, right, between the US and China, and being dragged into picking sides and so on and so forth. That's not going to be, that's easier said than done, but it's critical, I think, to their future prospects. But going on a bit more on the national interest issue, I think we also have to be careful about what areas or which within each of those four pillars can be served through national actions versus international cooperative agreements, right? So, reducing corruption, for instance, or increasing transparency, or improving labor standards, when negotiated in an international context, could end up being a tax on developing countries, right? So I think distinguishing between things that need to be pursued domestically in your own interests versus internationally, which could end up, being a tax, especially in the short run, that's something to bear in mind. This is improving labor standards is something we all want to aspire towards, but in an international context, it could harm developing country exports and benefit developed country, labor, where wages are much higher, and this is one way in which they can compensate for the higher wage costs, right? So that's so pick and be careful how you address some of these issues. They are really worthwhile initiatives, but some should be addressed domestically or nationally. Others might benefit from an international agreement of some sort. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, thank you. Now, the next two questions that I've received, probably we're also seeing in the Zoom chat box here. Okay, it's a little bit overlapping, so I will integrate these two questions together. First of all, like a question from Ambassador Del Rosario. Okay? So it's like one of the four pillars is the governance and anti-corruption. Okay, it's weighing on that, which can be used to encourage transparency in economic activities and relationships. Okay? So if there are not enough incentives under the framework, how do you think will this pillar's objective be enforced or encouraged? Okay, so I think we touched a little bit on looking into our own domestic issues and whatnot, especially regarding this one. So how do you think will this pillar's objective be enforced or encouraged? Yeah, this fourth one on tax and corruption. Okay, so we'll probably reverse the order again, like Dr. Menon and then Professor Manhid.
Sure. So I think, let me continue on what I was saying earlier about this, national versus international approaches. I think these sorts of international agreements can be useful opportunities to pursue domestic reforms, right? And governments can use the so-called our hands are tied approach, saying that, because of our commitments to this international accord, we are forced to pursue this domestically. We can see that playing out actually in Vietnam right now with the CPTPP, where they're pushing through difficult reform of their state-owned enterprises and so forth by using our hands are tied agreement, our hands are tied approach to the CPTPP agreement. So this is something you cannot actually forecast. It depends on the volition of each government, but the opportunity exists for them to use these sorts of agreements to pursue difficult national reforms. And these sorts of reforms under corruption and transparency and tax and so on usually have high short-term costs, and the benefits are dispersed over a larger group in the long term, right? So you have concentrated costs in the short run with the hope for long-term benefits dispersed over a larger group. Now, that's a difficult, difficult message to sell to an electorate, right? Especially one concerned about all these current uncertainties about growth and geopolitical tensions. But the hands are tied agreement, hands are tied approach to these agreements can be one way of pushing through difficult domestic reforms and overcoming vested interests at home, but governments must take leadership and do it in their own volition. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Okay, thank you, Dr. Menon. Professor Manhit, your thoughts?
Of course, as we commit to these 4 pillars of the Indo-Pacific economic framework for prosperity, I think it's an opportunity for an administration, like in our case, the Marcos Jr. administration, to use it for institution building, for reforms, especially when you line it up with their desire for investment-led growth, as I quote our own president and his economic team. You need this kind of institutional framework reforms that you can say, see, this is our commitment, and this can generate investments for us moving forward. So it's something that I hope our government use as an opportunity to have our own internal reforms. As I trust really our own economic team who speak about this, and the commitment also of our foreign affairs who went to be part of this first ministerial meeting last week. So hopefully, as you commit to it, because it's something that we've been wanting in the Philippines. This is the reason why at times investments look beyond us, jumps over us in terms of thinking, because we don't have these basic things: rule of law, transparency, and accountability in a way we transact, or sanctity of contracts even. So this is something that I hope that as we commit to it, our government executes it internally and builds on it to really attain this investment-led growth to deal with our long emergent economic emergency that continues to challenge the Filipino nation post-pandemic.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for that. And we weigh in on this, that I do realize that we do have a lot of opportunity as well to adopt certain reforms, especially should we want to continue and sustainably engage with our neighbors in the international community. It's a big insight that hopefully that we can see, as this interesting topic still pushes through. Okay, for that one. Now, again, 2 questions that I will be combining, because we're going to shift our attention towards the one who started it all, which is the United States. So the United States is currently experiencing 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. It's also experiencing inflation, labor unionization, civil unrest, etc., which would probably, and for that matter, coupled with uncertainty. I think Dr. Menon mentioned this a while ago regarding the upcoming midterm elections in the United States. So, in other words, the United States isn't really in an exact position to be an attractive partner as far as the framework goes. So why exactly? Okay, so how exactly will the United States, given its own domestic experiences at this point, and coupled with that uncertainty, there's a lot of talk now wherein the Republicans will probably win more seats, in Congress, and in Congress. So how will that probably position the United States after November or come 2023 as far as the framework is concerned? So yeah, first again we'll reverse the order. So we'll just go back and forth here. So Professor Manhit first, and then Dr. Menon.
I view things differently. I have seen the United States, especially the power of its private sector, the power of its military, anyone who is here in this call right now, when you talk of the military capacity of China, more in numbers, but short in distance. I don't know if people know that. And the collective power of 14 countries, and you add even the EU, UK, who will work with the United States, given their own Indo-Pacific economic frameworks. That's a powerful. So why do these countries see things that the one who asked the question did not see? Maybe he watches too much news instead of looking at papers itself. Look at the US dollar compared to the Philippine peso and other currencies. Look at the capacities of private companies. So I feel they are not in a good position, but they're still a viable partner. But this framework will not be driven by the US alone, but I think driven by countries there that are seen as allies by the United States. And I said, when I see this even expanding to other groups, as I kept on mentioning since earlier, the EU and the United Kingdom, because they have their own Indo-Pacific framework that focuses on the same, maybe not specific pillars, but basically the same values. So the collectiveness of the group. It's a reality that in a democracy, a sudden change of leadership. That's why it was straight earlier by Dr. Manon that, this should go beyond Biden. That's to be seen as the position of the United States. Because something that they collectively agree on is their position in the world. The Republican and the Democrats, they've been consistent on that with a little missteps or from Trump maybe in that 4 years experience. But he himself became so strong against what he considers a competitor of the United States. It's really the collectiveness of the group, that 14 countries, which can even expand more. That I see value in. Maybe the US started it, brought people together, or brought nations together, but how the 14 moves forward and sees value to it is what is important. And look at the values that it can create on clean energy, on governance issues, on supply chain issues, on trade. These are very important, especially for a country like the Philippines.
Is it
Thank
okay?
you.
Is it okay if I add something to what Professor Manhit mentioned? Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
Ambassador De
because
Rosario, please.
he mentioned about the values and the ideals of the agreement. In the case of TPP, the US withdrew, and yet it continued, isn't it? No, I mean I think that's what Professor Manhit is trying to say. The withdrawal of one country doesn't mean that the whole thing dies. The reason why the US was able to withdraw is because the TPP was not ratified immediately during the Obama administration, so that when Trump came in, he automatically, discarded it. But assuming that this IPEF is ratified somehow by the Senate of the United States, whoever wins, they will be bound by it, because the Americans, as we know, the principle of rule of law is dominant in all their relationships. So I support what Professor Manhit mentioned, that people will support it, and even if one country withdraws, the rest, because they believe in it, they'll move it. So TPP became CPPPP. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Del Rosario. Dr. Menon, you can weigh in.
Yeah, so I think I don't have much to add. I think, again, most of the issues have been covered, and I agree with them. I guess, at one level, whether or not the Senate, becomes more Republican or more Democrat, the whole anti-globalization sentiment in the US, or the sort of concerns over the hollowing out and the export of jobs and everything else that, they tie to this globalization will remain, right? And this is why I think there's bipartisan support that the US should not engage in any kind of FTA, because this is what they like to blame for their ailments, right? That their engagement with the developing world especially has led to the hollowing out of their manufacturing sector and so on. I don't think that's true, but I think that certainly is what sells at home in the US. So, but I think the future of IPEF, if they cannot get it through to a ratified treaty in the Senate, will lie with what Professor Manhit mentioned, which is the broader membership taking ownership of this arrangement, right? So if the other 13 countries can pick up and run with it, with or without ratification in the US Senate, then it'll have legs, right? And it can survive beyond Biden or any other US administration. But there still needs to be some kind of leader, I guess, right? Now, who will step up? Will Japan step up like they did with TPP? Probably, CPTPP, they might, especially now that, they share the US concerns over the rise of China. So, so that I think will really determine the future of IPEF beyond just the US, like with the TPP.
All right, thank you. Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, probably we'll also probably see a lot clearer. Like November is like not too far off. Okay, so yeah, hopefully we can see some more concrete progress and developments along the way. It's okay. So a little bit of time check. It's 3:34 p.m. by my clock here. I know we advertise it will only be until 3:30, but we do have one more question, and I hope that the panel and our audience will indulge us. Okay, it's been a very rich discussion so far, okay, with all these new insights, and I do realize how small like my own knowledge is as an academic as well. So, and this is like a more pointed or more specific, like an industry specific question. And this is coming from Mr. Eugene Texon of the National Security Council. So former DTI Secretary Ramon Lopez has strongly proposed for the United States to consider the Philippines as a strategic partner in the supply of critical minerals. So how would you assess the Philippine mining industry in relation to the IPEF? And what other trade and investment ventures can the Philippines go into under the IPEF? So I guess this is going to be more under the purview of Professor Manhit first, probably.
Yes.
Yes, sir. And then we'll have Dr. Menon weigh in as well.
I think on the mining side, where we are known to be rich in terms of copper, gold, nickel. I don't know what kind of strategic minerals that they're talking about, because this might not be in our within our geological resources. But why not? But it depends on also how our government through the years have really stunted the growth of our mining industry, considering we're well endowed and there are responsible mining companies who have invested in our country. Again, so there is an opportunity, because data would show that in mining provinces, you see the big impact of mining companies that are done responsibly in terms of paying taxes, helping the community. But broader than that is, for me, what I see is that opportunity to be part of that supply chain, to be an alternative. And I speak from experience. I'll wear my hat next minute or so as a consultant. When Trump was waging the trade war, there was a lot of look or view towards the Philippines by American multinationals, relocating the Philippines. Again, some of them were here, left, went to China, and started to look back. I got invited to speak in Korea when they launched the new Southern policy. That's what I saw also, that Korea is looking for that option because their economy is too tied in terms of supply chain to China. Even Taiwan, especially Taiwan now. But I saw that as early as February 2020. then the position of Japan. Just those three countries as a whole. Imagine if we can be part, get a pie of that shift from China. Because for some of these multinational countries, both US and Europe, they would like to see countries like us. If we can only create a better environment with regards to sanctity of contracts, in terms of investment policies, they prefer us than China, I think. As I talk to some of these companies, and during the last pandemic, I saw how we played a role in terms of providing some part of the supply chain of IT companies, because I helped them facilitate the movements from our export zones here. We talk about HP, Dell, Apple, when they were trying to ensure that they will not be affected with supply chain issues, given the long lockdown in the Philippines. Imagine if we can grow that more under the IPEF. No, I tend to be always optimist. Maybe put the word cautiously optimistic when you see this type of framework, but you have to be optimistic and look at it as an opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Professor Manhit. So it's always about an opportunity, right? It's going to be like trying to take it as an opportunity for us to for our own growth. Okay. Dr. Menon?
Yeah, I'd just like to echo what Professor Manhit mentioned. I think, the US-China trade war has created opportunities for many countries in the ASEAN region. We've seen quite a bit of relocation out of China into Vietnam especially, but also, Thailand and Malaysia. I think Philippines and Indonesia have been laggards for a long time. It's time to catch up. I think Professor Manhit has mentioned the key sort of constraints that need to be overcome, which is, a lot of which has to do with the domestic investment climate, to use a general term. Everything from, cost of doing business to, legal institutions and sanctity of contracts and rules and so on. So if you can get on top of that and use IPEF as a lever, but that's all IPEF will be, I think, a lever. There must be domestic leadership and commitment to pursue these difficult reforms. And if it happens, I think Philippines stands to gain tremendously, especially right now, when there's a lot of restructuring going on with supply chains. And this could be a major boost to addressing, poverty, especially. And we know that from studies done, the income effects of supply chain related trade is about double that of conventional trade. So the opportunity to lift people out of poverty, to improve inclusion and reduce inequality through greater engagement in supply chains is huge. As a laggard, there's a lot of room to grow, but those domestic constraints need to be overcome, and hopefully IPEF will provide that lever to finally address them, overcome vested interests that stand in the way of such reforms, and provide the Philippines the opportunity that it's been so keen to engage in for so long. I think this is the right time for that, with all this restructuring taking place all around China. I mean, even China is moving out of China, right? So there's huge opportunities to be gained if the domestic investment climate can be improved in the Philippines. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Oh, okay. Oh, wow. I was about to say that. Okay. I was about to say that I'm about to wrap up today's session, but maybe just very quickly, just like one final question here, and it's pointed towards what former Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad said. And there's a question here that said, many countries recognize that this is not an economic grouping, but it is truly more of a political grouping. Okay. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on this one? Okay. Maybe Ambassador Del Rosario can also weigh in on weigh in on this one. So Ambassador, you may want to start us off.
In political relationships, there's such a thing called statecraft. It's a toolbox. You use different tools to promote your national interests, and trade and investments are part of that toolbox. Definitely, the IPEF has a political, underpinning. You cannot remove that. It is really meant to strengthen a group of countries who are trying to work against the opacity or the non-transparency of another country, or the coercive diplomacy of another country, or maybe what we call the manipulative diplomacy of another country. So definitely this is a political grouping, but they are using economic statecraft. And for us, especially for those of us who work in foreign affairs and trade, to us that's a valid tool. So be it. And to me, I think if, as both of our speakers have said, if we become really an active member in this group, and if we pursue the objectives, I think it will lead to our own national growth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Del Rosario. Dr. Menon?
Yeah, so I think I agree. I think I don't often agree with my former Prime Minister, Dr. Mahathir, but this time I think he's right. All these groupings are political by and large, and they have economics sort of as attachments. Often, people said that TPP was a political or geopolitical agreement dressed up as a trade agreement. And that I think is true for all of them. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you can't engage on economic terms if you don't have good diplomatic and political relationships, right? And these types of agreements strengthen those relationships, and as Ambassador Del Rosario said, overcome a lot of those paucities and opaqueness of international relations. So yes, as usual, Dr. Mahathir has raised an interesting point, but it's an obvious point though this time. And I think there's everything to be gained from improving political ties, but there has to be substance to the economic package that underlies the political grouping, and that therein lies the big challenge. How much of the pillars, the four pillars, will end up having binding commitments from the member countries? That we don't know yet, and we'll have to wait and see. But if countries can see that it's in their interest to pursue these reforms, and that message has resonance at home, and they can be used, as I said, to overcome vested domestic interests that might stand to lose from those reforms. And there's a lot of that in the Philippines, as there are in many other ASEAN countries. Opening up your markets means a lot of losses for existing conglomerates, right? If those things can be overcome, then I think the long-term benefits are real. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. And of course, Professor Manhit, your thoughts on the matter.
Everything is political, is my view. As a political science faculty for 26 years, that's the first thing I tell my students for 26 years. So this type of agreement is political. It has value economically. It has value that in terms of trade and investment in a country. And at times, but political decisions or political interests supports national interests too. So what would we like to drive the economic environment, trade and investment environment in this region? Is it a group of countries that share the belief that we should live in a rule-based international system? One that believe on values of democracies, governance, transparency. So that makes it really political. It's a choice between one option, maybe, and the other will look that way. But at the end of the day, I say, just like I said earlier, it's about country's national interest. What serves your interest? And in this case, I believe there is an opportunity that this IPEF can serve the Philippines' national interest as we try to overcome the economic consequences of this pandemic and learn from it. Green economic recovery, issues of investment-led growth. Those are things that can lead us, that we need to achieve, and this kind of framework can help us achieve.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for that one. And okay, at this point, unfortunately, as much as we want to further engage in these discussions as academics do, we love to deep dive into all of the intricacies and the dynamics of issues that are of interest to us. I would have to play the bad guy and start cutting everyone off, because in the interest of time, we would need to end today's session. So I would like to invite Ambassador Del Rosario for any final remarks. Any final remarks? Closing statements. I'm so sorry. Before we go to that, let's. For everyone who is in the Zoom right now, let us give a virtual round of applause to Dr. Menon and Professor Manhit, for the valuable insights. Like, I myself have learned a lot, and as an academic myself, churning out frameworks in my head for further policy making with my own colleagues here in UP. So we hope that. So thank you so much. So Ambassador Del Rosario, thank you.
Well, I want to thank both for simplifying the concepts. IPEF is like TPP and everything else that has to go with economic diplomacy or political diplomacy. They're always complicated. But both of them presented the topics so simply. So the basic, understanding how somebody will understand these concepts, because every time during diplomatic hour, I always worry about our freshmen, because it's their first time to be, to be exposed to concepts like this. So to both of you, I wish to thank you, that you really simplified what is important in a framework. What does a framework do? What does it mean? And how does it work? All of this came forward during your discussions. So thank you very much. And I hope in the future, our paths will cross again. And to Dindo, I'll see you in a few days in another winner. Okay, thank you. And thank you, Eric, for that wonderful moderating function that you carried out today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and that's very gracious. Okay, so once again, we thank Dr. Jainat Menon and Professor Dindo Manhit, for sharing their valuable insights. And I hope this is just be the first of many discussions as we deep dive into this new initiative. In this new initiative that the United States has for the Indo-Pacific region, and we look forward to further developments, starting with the midterm elections in the United States, which will happen in November, and whatever directions that this will take us. To our audience, thank you so much for spending your time with us. I do hope that, as Ambassador Del Rosario and as myself have expressed, you have learned a lot, and have sparked even a little bit of, even a small interest for us to pursue these matters. Read up on it, monitor it closely, and refer to our panel of experts who have shared so much for this afternoon session. So once again, this is Eric Capistrano, your moderator and your host for today's Diplomatic Hour. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.